Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's going on in Cuba. If you've been following the channel, you'll know that Cuba is in a state of economic crisis. Cuba is the largest island in the Caribbean and is located around 100 miles off the south coast of America. And as a result of being an island that's a net importer, and up until the late 1950s, it had a strong trading relationship with its closest neighbour, the USA. However, after Fidel Castro took over power, nationalised a lot of American companies that were located in Cuba and decided to adopt communism and form an alliance with the Soviet Union, the USA cut its trading relations and introduced a trade embargo against Cuba. Now, during the 60s, 70s and 80s, Cuba was supported by the Soviet Union. However, the close bond and the strong trading relationship was weakened after the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. And Cuba went on to forge a strong relationship with Venezuela, which is another country that's adopted communism and also has large quantities of oil. But unfortunately for Cuba, the economy of Venezuela entered its own crisis around 10 years ago. And that situation was made much worse after the USA, the European Union, and most of the West applied sanctions against Venezuela from 2017 onwards. And as a direct result of the weakening of the trade relations that Cuba had built with the Soviet Union and Venezuela, Cuba has been in an economic crisis for a number of years, and that crisis is continuing to get worse. So in today's video, I want to share with you a story that's been published by the Wall Street Journal, which claims that China has agreed a deal with Cuba to set up an electronic eavesdropping facility on the island so that it can spy on the USA. And whilst that might sound a little far-fetched, this actually isn't the first time that Cuba have been involved in these sort of deals. Because back in the 1960s, Russia established a spy station in the north of Cuba. So we'll go through some of the details of that facility. We'll have a look at what's happening with regards to Cuba's inflation, its interest rates and exchange rates. And then we'll have a look at how Cuba is looking to rebuild its international relations. It recently had a meeting with the BRICS countries, and there are rumours that Cuba wants to join BRICS. We'll talk about Cuba's relationship with Europe and Russia. And then finally today I'll finish up with my summary as to what I think is likely to happen in Cuba over the course of the next 3 to 6 months.
A report from the Wall Street Journal on Thursday said China has reached a secret deal with Cuba to establish a spy facility on the island nation. According to the Journal report, China and Cuba have reached an agreement in principle, with China to pay Cuba several $billions to allow the eavesdropping station. A spy installation in Cuba, which is roughly 100 miles from Florida, would allow China to gather electronic communications from the southeastern U.S., which houses many U.S. military bases. Beijing would also be able to monitor ship traffic, the newspaper reported, citing U.S. officials familiar with classified intelligence. The reported deal comes as Washington and Beijing are taking tentative steps to soothe tensions that spiked after a suspected Chinese high-altitude spy balloon crossed the United States before the U.S. military shot it down off the East Coast in February. Thursday's report could also raise questions about a trip to China that U.S. officials say Secretary of State Antony Blinken is planning in coming weeks. Washington's top diplomat had earlier scrapped the visit over the spy balloon incident. A spokesperson for the Chinese embassy in Washington said it was not aware of the case and couldn't give a comment right now. The Journal said U.S. officials declined to provide more details about the proposed location of the spy station or whether construction had begun. But the Biden administration was quick to cast doubt on the report. Here's Pentagon Press Secretary and Air Force Brigadier General Pat Ryder.
I've seen that reporting. I can tell you based on the information that we have that is not accurate, that we are not aware of China and Cuba developing any type of spy station. Separately, I would say that the relationship that those two countries share is something that we continuously monitor. I would say that, as you've heard us say many times, China's activities both in our hemisphere and around the world, any concerning activities are something that we will continue to watch closely. But in terms of that particular report, no, it's not accurate.
Cuba's government also cast doubt on the report. with Vice Foreign Minister Carlos Fernandez de Casio calling it a U.S. fabrication meant to justify Washington's decades-old economic embargo against the island.
So the Wall Street Journal claims that China have agreed a deal with Cuba to set up a listening facility. But as you've just seen, there are a lot of denials. China is denying any involvement. The Cuban authorities are saying that they don't know anything about it. However, as I mentioned at the start of the video, this isn't the first time that Cuba have been involved in these sort of negotiations. In the early 1960s, so just after Fidel Castro took over power of the country, a deal was signed with the Soviet Union to build a signals intelligence facility in Lourdes in the north of Cuba. Construction commenced in 1962, and this facility was the largest of its kind operated by Soviet intelligence services outside of Russia. The facility itself was located on a site of 28 square miles and located less than 93 miles from Key West in the USA. And at its peak during the Cold War, the facility was staffed by over 1,500 KGB operatives. The complex was capable of monitoring a wide array of commercial and government communications through the southeastern United States and between the United States and Europe. Lourdes intercepted transmissions from microwave towers in the USA, communication satellite downlinks, and a wide range of shortwave and high-frequency radio transmissions. It also served as a mission ground station and analytical facility supporting Soviet satellites. The facility at Lourdes, together with a sister facility in Russia, allowed the Russians to monitor all US military and civilian communication satellites. It's also been alleged that the Lourdes facility monitored all White House communications activities, launch control communications, and telemetry from NASA and air facilities at Cape Canaveral, as well as financial and commodity wire services and military communication links. According to a 1993 statement by Cuban Defense Minister Raul Castro, Russia was said to obtain 75% of its military strategic information from Lourdes. The Lourdes facility enabled Russia to eavesdrop on US telephone communications and US voice and data transmissions relayed by satellites visible to the facility. In addition to its military strategic value, after the Cold War ended, Lourdes was increasingly used to support the Russian economy. In addition to unprotected commercial information, personal information about US citizens in the private and government sectors could also be snatched from airwaves and used by Russian intelligence to identify promising espionage recruits in these sectors. In 2014, following Russia's invasion of Crimea and the subsequent sanctions that were applied against it, it was reported that Russia was considering reopening Lourdes. However, these claims have never been substantiated. What the establishment of the Lourdes facility does prove is that it is possible to intercept US data and communications from Cuba. Now, ordinarily, when we're doing a deep dive on any country, we will go through a lot of the economic data to establish exactly what's happening in the economy. But the problem that we have when we're talking about Cuba is that the data is very limited. We don't get comprehensive statistics published on a monthly basis. But one of the things that Cuba does publish is its rate of inflation. And this chart shows the movement in the rate of inflation over the course of the last 12 months. And what this shows is that in June 2022, inflation was running at just under 29%, so incredibly high. However, over the course of the last 12 months, we have seen almost a consistent increase month on month in inflation. And the latest available figures show that inflation is now running at over 45%, which means that year on year prices are almost 50% higher than they were this time last year. However, the situation in Cuba is actually much worse than this, because these are the official statistics, and if you look at the reports on social media, it's claimed that the movement in prices is significantly more than 50%. So if you follow the channel, you'll know that a lot of countries have experienced high levels of inflation over the course of the last 2 years, and the traditional way of dealing with high inflation is to increase interest rates. So let's have a look at what's been going on with interest rates in Cuba. This chart shows the movement in interest rates in Cuba over the last 12 months. And as you can see, this is an entirely flat line, and interest rates have remained at 2.25% over the course of the last year. And actually, if we expand this graph out to show the situation over the last 25 years, you can see that the official rate of interest has been sitting at 2.25% for the whole time. So obviously that means there's been no attempts by the Cuban central bank to raise interest rates in order to try to bring down high levels of inflation. And the reason that the Cuban Central Bank haven't made any moves to increase interest rates is that they're not following the traditional capitalist model. They're operating a communist model. So the people of Cuba aren't taking mortgages to buy property, they're not taking loans to buy cars. The system that Cuba is operating is entirely different. But we've still got a major problem with inflation that needs to be addressed. But the problem from Cuba's perspective is that the reason that they're seeing such rapid increases in prices is that they're having to import the vast majority of goods that they're using. And as I'm sure you'll be aware, over the course of the last 18 months, we've seen prices rising. However, in the last 6 months, we have started to see prices coming back down, but not in Cuba. And one of the reasons for that is that Cuba is not a great counterparty to deal with. They don't have any cash, and therefore they're struggling to buy things in the open market and to be able to pay for all of their imports. Now, one of the common themes that we see where we have an economy that's in trouble and we have high levels of inflation is that we usually see a devaluation of the currency. As inflation starts to increase, that means that the value of the home currency is decreasing rapidly. And in these situations, the local population often abandon their home currency and start using things like the US dollar instead, which they have more confidence in. And in addition to that, countries that are struggling are often net importers, so there's no real demand for their currency. If they were exporting lots of goods, then other countries may need to buy their currency to pay for them, but if you're a net importer, nobody needs to do that. And in addition to that, countries that are struggling often fail to attract overseas investment, so they're not getting large quantities of foreign currency coming into the country. So for all of those reasons, we often see the currency starting to weaken. And this chart shows us the official movement of the US dollar against the Cuban peso over the course of the last 12 months. And once again, you can see that this is a flat line. The official exchange rate has been fixed at $1 to 24 Cuban pesos for the last 12 months. And if we expand the chart out to show the position over the last 10 years, you can see that there's only been one movement in the official exchange rate, which took place at the end of December 2020. So this obviously doesn't make any sense given everything that we've just discussed about what's going on in Cuba's economy. And the reason that this chart doesn't make any sense is that the Cuban peso is not a floating currency. The exchange rate is not being set by demand and supply in the markets, it's fixed by the Cuban authorities. However, in reality, nobody is doing business on the basis of an exchange rate of 24 to 1. And in terms of cash money exchange, the Cuban authorities themselves are actually working on a completely different rate. This chart shows the official cash exchange rates being offered in Cuba. And you can see that if you're looking to exchange US dollars, the official sell rate is 110 pesos to $1, and the official buy rate is $123. However, if you're looking to exchange US dollars in Cuba, you would not use the official exchange rate. You would use the black market rate. And this chart shows that the latest black market rate is 198 Cuban pesos to $1, which is more than 8 times higher than the official rate. And when you have a situation like this where there are 3 different exchange rates for the currency, what tends to happen is there is a high level of dollarization. And dollarization is the situation where the local population decide that they no longer want to use the local currency and that they would prefer to use US dollars. And that's what's happening in Cuba for a lot of the cash transactions. Cuba's economy minister, Alejandro Gil, recently stated that there is no quick fix for Cuba's sputtering economy, as inflation, fuel shortages, plunging farm production, and a cash crunch drag on output and continue to fan discontent in the communist-run nation. He went on to say that there was too little foreign currency on the island to pay for fuel, food, and farm imports, meaning Cuba will increasingly need to scrape by on what it can produce at home. If we can't produce it, we won't have it, he told lawmakers, referring specifically to some food products and urging legislators and municipalities to put renewed impetus on farm output this year and next. Tourism, once a key driver of much-needed foreign exchange, has struggled to revive, with visitor numbers between January and April 2023 only half of the same period from 2019. And this has left the country short of the foreign currency necessary to import critical farming necessities like fertiliser and animal feed. As an example, the production of pork for the state plunged from a record 199 tonnes in 2017 to just 16 tonnes in 2022. And it's reported that many fruits and vegetables have fared equally poorly. Fuel that might otherwise help bolster farm production and deliver goods to market has been rerouted to electricity generation, and Cuba used nearly twice as much diesel as planned to produce electricity in the first 4 months of 2023. The economy minister went on to say that soaring food prices due to inefficiencies and dwindling production have far outpaced the buying power of most Cubans, leaving many with salaries short of covering their basic needs.
Cuba's rock-bottom economy and its inability to provide for the island's 11 million residents continues to promote strife. A hefty portion of food comes from the United States. The headline, Cuban government-controlled food purchases and imported from the U.S. are down 21%.
They're not importing as much overall because they don't have money.
In 2021, U.S. to Cuba commodity exports, such as chicken, $28.5 million worth. By 2022, down to $26 million, and in the 12-month period ending March of 2023, almost $20.5 million. Cuba used to be a major producer of coffee. Now they have to import from the U.S.
One, incredible mismanagement. Two, state involvement, which makes it incredibly inefficient. Three, weather. The areas where the plantations are have just gotten pummeled every year.
Since 1959, Cuba has relied upon strong relationships with other countries to help its economy. And as a result of the current ongoing economic crisis, Cuba is now looking to forge new relationships. And one of the growing trade alliances is what's called BRICS. BRICS is a trade alliance which currently consists of Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, but is considering expanding its membership, and a growing number of countries have expressed interest in joining. Once viewed as a loose association of disparate emerging economies, BRICS has in recent years taken more concrete shape, driven initially by China and, since the start of the Ukraine war in February 2022, has had added impetus from Russia. And at a recent BRICS conference held in Cape Town, South Africa, a number of other nations were invited along to talk about potentially joining BRICS, including Iran, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Cuba, Democratic Republic of Congo, Comoros, Gabon and Kazakhstan. In addition to the representatives that attended in person, Egypt, Argentina, Bangladesh, Guinea-Bissau and Indonesia also participated virtually. China stated during 2022 that it wanted BRICS to start a process to admit new members, and India's foreign minister said that the recent talks had included deliberations on the guiding principles, standards, criteria and procedures of what an expanded BRICS bloc would look like. South Africa's representative stated that foreign ministers were aiming to complete work on a framework for admitting new members before the BRICS leaders meet at a summit in Johannesburg in August. So it looks from the nature of this recent meeting that BRICS is now looking to expand its membership significantly to develop new global trading relations that would compete with the West. It's been announced that Iran's president, Ebrahim Raisi, is due to visit Cuba, Nicaragua and Venezuela in order to expand bilateral cooperation between Iran and the three countries, with a view to helping with economic, political and scientific issues. In addition to the improvement of the relationship with Iran, it's also been announced that Venezuela's deliveries of crude oil and fuel to Cuba increased in May to 58,100 barrels per day, compared with 45,250 barrels in April. So Cuba is currently looking to expand its relationships globally, but interestingly, during a recent visit by EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell, it was revealed that Cuba's top trade partner is actually the European Union. And he went on to say that the EU accounted for around 1/3 of foreign trade on the island, compared with 8% for China and 8% for Russia. He also stated that the European Union was the second largest source of tourism for Cuba, behind Canada. Since the start of the Ukraine war, the amount of trade between Russia and Cuba has increased significantly. Bilateral trade between the two countries reached $450 million in 2022, which was 3 times higher than the amount in 2021. And in the first 4 months of 2023, total trade was $138 million, which is 9 times higher than the corresponding period from 2022. Russia has now signalled its intent to further increase the levels of trade, and Russian officials and business leaders leaders have signed multiple deals with Cuban counterparts at a forum held recently in Havana, agreeing to work together to boost sugar and rum output, assure the supply of wheat and crude oil to Cuba, and overhaul crumbling tourist facilities. The longtime political allies, both of which are now subject to US sanctions, are seeking to cement economic ties by facilitating trade and investment. In his closing speech at the forum, Ricardo Cabrizas, Cuba's foreign trade minister, stated these deals constitute a milestone in the history of our bilateral and business ties. The agreements include a contract for Russia to supply wheat to Cuba's state-owned Allen port, which is aimed at guaranteeing the stability of supply for the Cuban population. Another deal would create a Cuba-based marketplace for Russian goods, including food and home goods, called Rusmarket, which will also help spur development of more direct and fluid shipping routes between the two countries. A third deal states Russian and Cuban intention to revive the decrepit residential beach community of Tarara, whose white sand beaches just minutes from Havana, according to the documents, are ideal for enjoying the ocean, fishing and diving. The Russian Deputy Prime Minister for Tourism, Sport, Culture and Communications also announced a presidential order to reinstate by July 2023 regular flights between Russia and Cuba, which have been suspended since the start of the Ukraine conflict. Other agreements also announced included one aimed at developing a Russian-Cuban rum company, which would seek to boost exports of Cuba's prized rum, and Russia will also provide funds, know-how and technology to restart a steel mill in Cuba to supply construction materials on the island. So the commitments from Russia to increase the levels of trade with Cuba is obviously good news for Cuba. However, in return for this increased trade, Cuba have set new precedents to attract in those Russian investors. Individuals from Russia who invest in Cuba will be allowed to lease land for 30 years, an unprecedented step in the history of Cuba's communist government. Boris Titov, Russia's presidential commissioner for entrepreneurs' rights and chairman of the Russia-Cuban Business Council, recently announced that Cuban authorities are ready to provide special conditions for Russian businessmen, which include the right to make use of Cuban land for 30 years, duty-free importation of agricultural machinery, and the right to repatriate profits in foreign currency, which the Cuban government currently restricts. In a separate announcement, the Russian Deputy Prime Minister said that the Cuban government had also green-lighted Russian banks to open subsidiaries to finance Russian businesses on the island, and that the countries will transition to ruble-based investment in our joint projects. It was also announced that Russian state airline Aeroflot will resume regular flights to Cuba on July the 1st. This flurry of announcements is the clearest sign yet of the Cuban government's decision to move away from opening its economy to US investors in favour of its old political ally as the islands seek a lifeline out of its economic crisis. The new arrangements with Russia are likely to add tension to Cuba's already strained relationship with the USA at a time when the Biden administration is moving to further expand sanctions against Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. Cuba's Minister of Foreign Commerce, Ricardo Cabrizas, said of the economic ties with Russia, "Nothing and no one can stop it," which contrasts entirely with the Cuban government's response to the Biden administration's authorization to a US company to offer a loan and invest in small private businesses in Cuba last year, which was the first time that such a move had been made for several decades. Officials from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs have tried to assure potential US investors, in particular Cuban Americans, that they can do business on the island. However, the lack of Cuba's response to the US license and the increased ties with Russia signal that the hardliners are winning for now. And allowing Russian companies to lease land might be particularly controversial because American citizens and companies still hold certified property claims over land confiscated by Fidel Castro shortly after he took power in 1959. The Cuban government is the country's largest landowner after Castro ordered the confiscation of most land through a so-called agrarian reform. Excessive government control over lands, farming, food distribution and prices has caused agricultural production to plummet, and economists have advised the government to let more Cubans own or lease land for agriculture. For Russia, finding new markets for its products has become more crucial after its invasion of Ukraine led to financial and economic sanctions by the US and the European Union. Several officials have travelled recently to Cuba, which Putin sees as a key ally and is based around 90 miles away from the US shores. In response to these announcements, John Cavelich, president of the US-Cuba Trade and Economic Council, whose company received the US government license to invest in a private business in Cuba, stated that the concessions were not representative of a robust government-run economy and that it was almost a message of desperation. He went on to say that given Cuba's financial history, it is quite likely that the Russian experience may not be long-lived. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video firstly to give you an update as to what's happening in the economy in Cuba. And as we've seen from today's data, things are getting worse. There's currently no end in sight in terms of being able to sort out this situation. Because as we discussed at the start of the video, Cuba is an island and therefore is a net importer. So it needs cash to be able to buy in all of the essentials such as fuel and food. And Cuba's situation is actually acutely worse than a lot of other countries in the same position because electricity generation in Cuba is dependent upon oil. Because of the strong relationship between Cuba and the Soviet Union in the 60s and 70s, the country built lots of power stations that were fed by oil that was being supplied to Cuba for free by Russia. Now, unfortunately for Cuba, that relationship broke down in the 1990s, and since that time, Cuba has had to rely upon Venezuela to supply it with oil and also to buy oil in the open markets. But clearly, at the moment, Cuba doesn't have any money to be able to purchase that oil, so it's having to rely upon favours and credit being provided to it by countries such as Venezuela, China and Russia. And as Cuba doesn't have a wealth of natural resources that it can tap into to be able to sort out its problems, the only way that it's going to be able to get back on track is by getting some assistance from other countries. Now, as we've seen in today's video, Russia has stated its intention that it wants to do more trade with Cuba. It wants to rebuild that relationship, partly because it's lost a lot of its other trading relationships around the world directly as a result of its invasion of Ukraine and all of the sanctions that have been applied against it. But in addition to expanding its relationship with Russia, Cuba is also keen on developing its relationship with China and the other BRICS nations. And as part of the expanding relationship with China, it's now been reported that China have signed a deal to set up a station in Cuba to be able to spy on the USA. Now, as it stands at the moment, this is an unsubstantiated rumour. It was reported in the Wall Street Journal, so it's come from a relatively reputable source, but nobody is admitting that this is actually happening. But, as we saw in today's video, this has been done before. Russia set up a spy station back in the 1960s and used that all the way up until 2001. And it's reported that Russia got a lot of intelligence both from the military side of things, but also commercially sensitive data from that station. And as technology has advanced a lot over the last 60 years, it's likely that if China did set up a facility, they would be able to access data and communications. And of course, one of the biggest issues that the global economy is facing right now is the growing tension between the USA and China. These are the two largest economies in the world and make up more than 40% of total global GDP. So we are talking about two superpowers here, but unfortunately they're butting heads at the moment. They don't want to share technology, they don't want to share data, and there's a lot of friction rising. So if China did set up a facility in Cuba to be able to listen to all of the USA's communications, that's likely to cause even more problems. So it really doesn't surprise me that China have denied that they are setting this facility up. Now, the USA are currently saying that these rumours are not true, but I think it's equally likely that that would be their official stance, even if they knew it was true, because they want to continue gathering more data and intelligence on what's actually happening. So it will be really interesting to see what happens over the course of the next 3 to 6 months, whether or not we do start to see the old facility that Russia used to operate in Lords being remanned and lots of Chinese operatives suddenly appearing with headphones and listening devices. So I'll make sure that I keep you posted as soon as there's any news breaking on that topic. But in terms of the overall summary of what's going on in the Cuban economy, unfortunately, there is no good news. Things are getting worse, and unless Cuba gets a large injection of cash from one of the friendly nations who are looking to get closer to it, it's likely that this situation will continue for the next 3 to 6 months. We'll continue to see people leaving the country. There's been a large migration of people who've had enough. They just can't take it anymore. They don't want to live in Cuba. They'd rather go overseas. I think that's likely to continue through the course of 2023. And unless Cuba can do some sort of deal with Russia or China or the BRICS countries, there doesn't look to be any end in sight. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's episode, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.